Hi, everybody. Welcome. We've had a bit of a technical snafu, but I think we're all set to go now. So thanks for sticking around. I hope you have. I'll be quick here. Welcome and thanks to all gathered with us online today. My name is Michael Piper, Director of the Master of Urban Design Program, and I'm delighted to welcome you to Shared Space, Shared Vision, Shared Power, Advancing Racial Justice in American Cities with Stephen Gray. So welcome, Stephen. First, I would like to acknowledge the land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. So I'll pass it over to Fadi, who will give us a bit more of a welcome, or a bit more of a welcome to Stephen.
Thank you, Michael. My name is Fadi Masoud, and I'm an assistant professor of landscape architecture and urbanism and the director of the Center for Landscape Research here at the Daniels faculty. Today, I'm extremely honored and excited to introduce Stephen Gray. Stephen, as many of you know, is a really good friend to many of us on the faculty. And just a little caveat, we were once roommates, and he was probably the best roommate I've ever had. So I'm really glad to see you here again, Stephen. We know how busy you are, so we're honored and grateful to have you join us. Stephen is an associate professor of urban design at Harvard's Graduate School of Design and the founder of Boston-based firm Grayscale Collaborative. His work operates at the intersection of research and practice, and his interests center on the political and cultural justice in cities, as well as the socio-ecological urban design approaches to resilience. This afternoon, Stephen will be talking about the subject of shared space, shared vision, shared power, advancing racial justice in American cities. And as you may know, the Daniels faculty's integrated core urbanism studio that Michael Piper, Roberto Damiani, and I coordinate asks us to look at design's agency in addressing questions of urban, social, and environmental justice. As such, your timing of your talk, Stephen, is very much welcome and appreciated. So please join me in welcoming Stephen Gray.
Thank you, Fadi, and thank you, Michael, for the warm intro. I didn't mention in our warm-up version of this start that my 6-year-old is home from school today. And so if I suddenly mute and my mouth keeps moving and I look a little more stern than I am in the presentation, he's 6, so that's what that is. But I'm going to share my screen and hope that we don't have any of that. Can you see my cover slide? Okay, great. So my talk today, as was said, is entitled Shared Space, Shared Vision, Shared Power, Advancing Racial Equity in American Cities. So the design of cities really concentrates resources in some places and marginalized communities in others. And this is a sort of a diagram of Boston that shows that sort of socio-spatial and socioeconomic division within cities. And this is really true for many, if not most cities across the planet. And while the particular histories, policies, practices, and projects producing these socio-spatial divisions may vary by territory, the lines of separation invariably demarcate differences in race, ethnicity, caste, or class. The relationship between space and these politically constructed forms of identity inform where people live or don't live, determine their relative access to resources and opportunities, define the power dynamics involved with how spaces are used and governed, and over time really produce material consequences and new collective identities, which are rooted in both physical and cultural geographies. As such, space, manifesting as both public and private infrastructures, becomes a key tool for bringing architects, planners, political actors, and social movements into direct dialogue within prevailing social, economic, political, and ideological discourses and practices where the politics of identity play out. And this is just a snapshot. If you look at different concentrations of some of the top immigrant groups in Boston and the physical infrastructures around which they organize, right? So you have Dominicans really organizing around Franklin Park and the Arboretum, and then you have Cape Verdeans really organizing around a church. And so when we think about the ways in which we're engaging and trying to have impact with particular groups, it's important and useful to understand the physical infrastructures around which they're organized so that we can have really targeted impact. We really can't talk about physical infrastructure in the United States without also talking about race. I teach a course in the spring called Urban Design and the Color Line, and it's really geared towards connecting students to an understanding of our role as urban designers in both the making of and potentially the dismantling of structures of racism. So we start with looking at cultures of racism, really the creation and evolution of racial ideology, which in the United States and in much of the Americas was used to justify slavery, both while it was happening and after it was over. Moving into geographies of racism, which really is the sort of socio-spatial manifestation of those cultural understandings and norms, which then translate into where people live or don't live. And then infrastructures of racism, which are the delineations between those geospatial maps that we produce on the regular, but there's a physical boundary, and that physical boundary might be a road, it might be a rail, it might be a river, it might be a park, it might be a land use, but it is a physical infrastructural space that we as urban designers have agency and leadership in thinking about both the making of and the remaking of. So my presentation today really lies at this intersection of race and the production of space in the United States. Worldwide, we're really experiencing two colliding public health emergencies that are really have come into focus in the United States over the last 2 years. COVID-19 and systemic racism. Both of these have public health, public policy, and urban design implications, and both are overwhelmingly killing Black people. And this was not inevitable. As we all know, the coronavirus does not discriminate, even if you want to think it does, and that you're immune for some reason. But where it's lacking in racial bias, the United States has really made up for with a resilient and highly adaptive white supremacist capitalist racial ideology. It is justified spatial and economic exclusion through segregation and redlining, racial terrorism through Jim Crow laws and community massacres, community theft through blockbusting and predatory lending practices, targeted community removal through urban renewal and federal highway programs, the criminalization of Blackness and the loss of voting rights and even citizenship through mass incarceration and deportation, or simply blanket ethnic exclusion. But many planners, designers, and policymakers still operate with primarily an economic impact imperative in the work that we do, ignoring the very real social implications, good, bad, or otherwise, that our decisions have for society. So what we actually need to address social inequities is a sort of a radical redistribution of resources, redistribution of opportunities, and a redistribution of power. And this really requires first acknowledging the intersectionality of race, class, and the production of space, interrogating our contribution to and complicity with structural and infrastructural racism, and developing methodologies and interventions to address issues of racial injustice. The spatialization of race really intensified in the United States in the middle of the 20th century with the collision of two post-World War II migratory patterns. First, a mid-20th century peak in the Great Migration saw Black Americans moving north and west to escape Jim Crow laws of the Deep South and pursue economic opportunity. This was quickly followed by white flight of white Americans moving to suburbs, motivated by the promise of a better life, but also fueled by federally funded and insured mortgage lending, which chiefly benefited white veterans and steered them away from red-lined inner city neighborhoods, which were becoming increasingly Black. Publicly funded highways and urban renewal projects swept through US cities, promising to connect and rebuild crumbling urban cores, but instead systematically dismantling them. Policies and programs designed under the auspices of nation building, city building, and the building of homes for an emerging American middle class successfully increased home ownership in suburban communities outside of cities with easy access back in, but they did so by separating or clearing the same Black neighborhoods that white Americans were fleeing, disproportionately harming racialized minorities, which had already been spatially constrained by decades of racial zoning and restrictive deeds. The results were sprawling suburban utopias for white Americans and hyper-dense low-income ghettos for Black Americans. And while the dominant narrative supporting urban renewal projects from the 1950s through the 1980s was a myth of economic necessity, the claim that everyone was apparently leaving cities and something had to be done to save them. But in fact, Black populations were increasing in cities at this time with the Great Migration, peaking at precisely the same time that federally funded urban renewal plans and highway projects were being drawn up. As Black families moved into cities to improve their economic circumstances, white families left for the suburbs, taking with them the local tax base, which had previously supported and maintained inner city infrastructures. White families were furnished with low-cost government-backed entries into the middle class, while Black families were trapped in the least desirable corners of the city, further concretizing the spatialization of race, resources, and power. Many settled in segregated inner city neighborhoods, and in Boston, were concentrated in a wedge-shaped area of the city where many Black Americans and immigrants still live today. Experiencing dramatic disparities in wealth, educational attainment, and life expectancy, as well as below average access to jobs, open space, and public transportation. So for example, life expectancy in the neighborhood of Back Bay is 92 compared to Roxbury, which is 58. So the focus of my research and practice is really on spatializing and rectifying social inequities through processes of radical inclusion and design intermediation, and exploring new ways to redistribute resources, redistribute opportunities, and redistribute power. So today I'll give a brief overview of 3 examples of what shared space, shared vision, and shared power can look like across sectors and communities, and how we can really begin to move the needle closer to racial justice. The first is capturing value from private market development for BIPOC communities, Black, Indigenous, people of color, through shared space in Boston Seaport. The second is ensuring that large public investments in infrastructure contribute to a shared vision and shared benefits for Uptown Cincinnati. And then finally, entrusting communities with the decision-making power, even budgetary decision-making, as shared power along Boston's Emerald Necklace Park system. In American cities, strongly delineated color lines still separate white residents from residents of color. And 10 years ago, Boston Seaport looked like this. It was hailed at the time as the last major opportunity to build a neighborhood that reflects Boston's rich cultural diversity. Instead, we built the most economically and racially exclusive neighborhood in the city. And while Boston officially became a majority-minority city in 2010, our newest neighborhood is 89% white. Led by private real estate developers, it caters disproportionately to white residents and visitors. And so on the left here, you see what you see are real headlines. And on the right are the kind of headlines that we would hope to see. This is a little exercise that we did for the Massachusetts Port Authority to try to get their attention and get their focus on the importance of, even in their own self-interest, of racial equity and racial justice, especially in the public realm. And so as you can see, economic development doesn't automatically lead to more equitable spaces. In fact, it tends to result in the opposite. But if approached with a racial equity agenda, it could actually end in racial equity outcomes. So how do we design for racial and cultural inclusion in elite spaces that are driven by capital? Pre-development activation was a way in which we tried to use a sort of a Trojan horse to get that question answered in the public realm of the seaport. So I began working with the Massachusetts Port Authority a few years ago to develop an inclusive public realm strategy. Massport has always played an important role in welcoming diverse communities into Boston and really acting as the port of entry. So this public realm initiative really focused on bringing that diversity back into an otherwise homogeneous seaport, celebrating difference and building a more inclusive future together. The idea was to anchor young creatives from underrepresented neighborhoods as the artists, designers, small businesses, builders, and activators of the public realm. And so the idea in a nutshell was temporary and experimental programs. So the Port Authority being the owner and overseer of both the airport and the seaport, they had a lot of shipping containers on hand. So this was one example where the use of shipping containers as temporary installments was actually explicitly and perfectly appropriate But really using these shipping containers to define temporary spaces, inviting diverse programmers and artists to activate those spaces, so that during schematic design and design development, the architects could actually see the space used in new and creative ways, and then embedding the thinking that's happening in a more organic way into the more permanent solution. And the idea was that that Massport would sort of fund the first of these, but then eventually require developers to use a portion of their public realm funding in this sort of pre-development phase of work. We weren't able to actually get this done in Boston, unfortunately. It's always a challenge, and we can talk maybe in the Q&A about, you know, the alignment that needs to happen between idea, moment in time, and client. And so we didn't have that alignment, but fortunately this was deployed. This was actually a stack that was designed by Low Tech, the container architects in New York. And they found another home for it as the sort of scaffold for a large JR exhibition in the Domino Sugar Factory after his exhibition at the Brooklyn Art Museum. So we moved into a smaller scale and we said, okay, how can we actually do this at a scale that our client is comfortable with and that we can really test concept and prove concept and then move into a larger scale. So this became a way of sort of just activating under-activated edges and corners, edges of parking lots that we could sort of take over for a period of time and show that the potential of other people's imagination being instrumental in redefining the public realm. So here, the pre-development activation principles were really creating opportunities for diverse cultural representation, ensuring inclusive business development. Business development was important because it's one thing to invite people into a space to hang out. It's another thing if they can actually take ownership and be connected to the economic opportunity that space is actually focused on creating. Authentic public realm activation, making sure that the activation that's happening is authentic to the city and the people in the city and to the broad array of people that represent what Boston is. And a commitment to experimentation and testing and really being open to failure and being open to new discoveries. So in the last project, let me go back one. The successes really come from fully collaborative, cross-sectoral, and engaged approach to activating the public realm and establishing a strong foundation for social and economic inclusion going forward. So next we'll move to Cincinnati, which is my hometown. Uptown Cincinnati is the second largest job center in the city of Cincinnati, but it's also characterized as having limited access to public open space, challenging pedestrian connections, undefined streetscapes, and a lack of public realm amenities, a lack of community investment in the form of residential development and neighborhood connectivity, high levels of vehicle dependence and traffic impacts, difficulty accessing and navigating the space, and no unified identity among the various uptown neighborhoods and institutions. And you can kind of see that that's what that looks like. The initial economic impact analysis that was done before I got involved in this project when I was at Sasaki Associates was to make a case for a new highway interchange, actually, which was going to bring new traffic onto the main roads, but also give greater access and greater opportunity for redevelopment along MLK and Reading Road, particularly at that intersection. There was very little consideration, though, for the surrounding neighborhoods, which are mostly Black, that don't have access to vehicles and are living already in an area that is mostly dominated by surface parking. So you've got folks who are surrounded by surface parking, don't drive, and they're being asked to take part in a process to think about how this new interchange is going to improve their lives. There was obviously a deep-seated mistrust of the institutions by communities, and that had led to a neglected and crumbling physical environment and a real mismatch between the needs of communities and the actions of this consortium of medical and institutions of higher learning. So while this is the vision that we developed this vision together. While this vision looks much like any competent urban design vision might look, it's really the process of getting to this vision, which is critical to its success and its contribution to all of the various stakeholders involved, particularly the surrounding communities. So keep this in mind as we move forward. So when I came onto the project, we started by doing another market analysis, which took a greater account of the larger forces and factors in the surrounding communities, this time including the communities in the consideration, not just the institutions and the highway traffic impacts. We identified that there was, in fact, a significant lack of demand for commercial space in the neighborhood center, so all of those red areas. There was essentially a demand for 800,000 square feet of retail and about 1 million square feet of space available. There were also concerns that any new commercial activity along the MLK corridor would compete with these already struggling neighborhood centers. And so our study was able to actually show that the unmet demand of roughly 2 million square feet of new housing over 10 years, which was what the projected demand for housing would be, could actually support some of these commercial deficiencies. And the committee agreed that we should actually focus all new residential development near these neighborhood centers and within a 10-minute walk, so that future residential development could actually support the retail deficit, bringing new people into the community instead of what institutions often do to surrounding communities, which is buy up, devalue housing, buy it up cheap, demolish it, land bank it as surface parking, and then eventually expand their institutional footprint deeper into the community as their needs grow. So this diagram, while it's pretty, straightforward and simple, actually became a powerful tool for communities that were involved in this process to remind institutions of their commitment to adding housing to neighborhoods and not demolishing it. It also gave communities some peace of mind that anything that happened along these major corridors was not really going to impact the sort of watershed of their neighborhood centers and the commercial viability therein. So after a 9-month process, 6 institutions and 6 neighborhoods developed a shared vision. And the success of this project is really based heavily on the makeup of the steering committee. It was a fully democratic and horizontal body of cross-sectoral partners made up of institutions, city officials, business owners, community development corporations, and community-engaged, community-based organizations. So this was, I guess, what you would call a grass tops group, not a grassroots group. The difference being folks that are representing the grassroots in a more sort of professionalized way, as opposed to everyone being invited to an open house. So the distinction is important, but it also allowed us to have very high-level conversations and make sure that very complex perspectives were put on the table from all of those involved. And it eventually led again to the shared vision, which was illustrated in that rendering at the beginning of this section. So the consortium is now in the process of assembling over 100 properties. They're following the urban design guidelines for phasing and implementation and working to attract new anchors. And the first anchors are already under construction at the intersection of MLK and Reading Road, right along the interchange. But really the biggest successes of this project were quite unexpected and unplanned for. After developing these productive relationships, these working relationships through the master plan process, 2 collaborative programs were co-conceived among the institutions and local community development corporations. The first was the first market rate housing being constructed in the neighborhood since 1990, developed by local community development corporations, Black run and Black owned, and on institutional land that had previously, many years back, been part of the neighborhood fabric. The second, which I think was even more interesting, was a resident stabilization program, which was initiated by one of the consortium members, Children's Hospital, in the form of forgivable home loans. And these home improvement loans were basically targeted to existing residents so that they could avoid gentrification-induced displacement. And for those residents who took those loans up to $35,000 and stayed in their home for up to 5 years after taking the loan was completely forgiven. So now back to Boston. As I said earlier, the COVID-19 pandemic has really heightened our need for and use of public parks and outdoor spaces. And I'm sure, just as it is at the GSD and everywhere else in the world, it's a hot topic of conversation, particularly in landscape. What is the future of public space, and how can we really take advantage of this moment when people have their eyes on the importance of being outside and being safely together in new ways? Elected officials in cities, Boston included, love to brag about things like, every resident lives within 5 to 10 minutes of a park. But we all know that not all parks are created equally in size, quality, or programmatic offerings. And so who do our public spaces serve? Who are we designing for, and who gets to decide? I began work with the Emerald Necklace Conservancy over a year ago to develop an equity agenda that aims to translate Frederick Law Olmsted's 19th century vision for public space of urban ecology, public health, and democratic exchange into a 21st century city resource focused on environmental justice, health equity, and racial justice. The first step was really asking how well underserved communities were being served. So we took a look at Black, Indigenous, people of color, BIPOC residents, as well as youth and elderly living within a 10-minute walk of the Emerald Necklace Park system. And this map is a little bit, could be confusing. It may look as though all of those people are the ones who live closest to the parks. We've actually just chosen to mask out those living beyond the 5 and 10-minute walk. So actually these tones are repeated. These are the darker tones out here. This is that wedge shape in Boston where most of the people of color tend to live. But there are concentrations in very particular neighborhoods around the Emerald Necklace that give us the opportunity to really engage with folks and understand how the parks can serve them better. Next, we looked at the folks who were making decisions about the park and what happens in the park, and really understanding the governance model involved, who's in control. And you can see by this map, it seems to be well represented spatially, although it's actually not. I'll show you in another slide that where the deficits are. But in terms of community voice, there's almost none here. Franklin Park Coalition near Franklin Park may be one of the primary community voice reps in this consortium, but there's not much elsewhere. And actually, if you look at the breakdown, the spatial breakdown of the park in different components, and you look at where those voices are being represented and what issues and areas they're representing, and then you look at the underrepresented population change over the course of those different segments of the park, as well as children and youth populations, as well as actually the overall park acreage, which is actually an unusual correlation. There's a huge delta, a huge deficit in voice and representation where there's the greatest need and the greatest parkland. And so how do we begin to sort of address and fill this delta and bring community voice into the decision-making about the parks and the use of the parks in the future? So, we looked at, the governance structure in terms of the various sectors that are represented. And you can see you've got the Conservancy, you've got their board and executive committee, you've got the overseers, those red dots that were along the first map. You've got 2 cities, you've got state, you've got federal representation, and then you have task forces that are really focused on this celebration of Olmsted's birthday, 200th birthday next year, which is the sort of impetus of this project. But what you don't see any of is the yellow. You don't really see any neighborhood voice in any of this structure. And so we really were working on trying to find a way to adjust the decision-making sort of governance structure in just this sort of pilot space as a way to prove concept, as a way to demonstrate that, in fact, communities can make decisions about what they want in their public spaces, and they can, in fact, make decisions that are connected to money. And so it's not about inviting people in to sort of, tinker around the edges and decide, what kind of seating or benches we want to have in a particular space, but really to say, do we even want to have this program at all? And is this even the space that we want to have it? And so beyond the sort of fiduciary decision-making power, which we're allocating to this, what we're calling committee of neighborhoods, represented by an ad hoc committee of representative groups across the various neighborhoods. We are also thinking about the ways in which they interpret the spaces that need to be activated as higher or lower priority. So in fact, there is a boundary line of the Emerald Necklace, but if this group were to decide that they want to fund a project or program that is well outside of that boundary line, that is within the purview of them as a governing body to decide. And so the idea is we fundraise, we give them the money, we invite a small group of people in at the beginning, they decide who else joins their committee, they set their bylaws, and then they allocate community funds, community grants to the projects and programs that they see as being the best ones for them. And so this is just a too much text slide, but the idea is that all of these different neighborhoods are represented on this committee, and that there is also a way for them to have representation permanently moving forward, both on the Emerald Necklace Conservancy Board, on the Overseers Group, and within the sort of ongoing governance, even if this project and initiative were not to last, that there would be some permanent footprint it would make. And really thinking about not just looking inwardly, but understanding the relationship to the work and the impacts that we have on the outside. These impacts include employment and economic opportunity, affordable housing, mobility and neighborhood connectivity, health and well-being, cultural preservation, diverse demographics, all of these things that are not considered physical infrastructure or not considered the purview of public space advocates. But all of these things are impacted by those investments in those public infrastructures. And so not including that in the thinking at the beginning, in a system which is inherently skewed against people of color and for a sort of white dominant culture, is going to end up with the default happening, which is harm to many communities of color. So for designers and planners interested in inclusive public spaces and justice in cities, it's really important for us to be able to first recognize the social and spatial manifestations of systemic racism, and second, to make connections between systems of racism, social inequality, and the built environment. We really need to contextualize contemporary urban challenges within these legacies of racialized policy and practice. And what we need to be doing is redistributing resources, right? We have people living in under-resourced communities that deserve investment, redistributing opportunities, because we don't need to force integration or force people to live in places they don't necessarily want to live, but we need to give them the opportunity to do so should they want to. And redistributing power, really changing the sort of balance, tipping the scales, so that public servants are in fact public servants and serve the public, and that the public are actually the clients and are actually driving the conversation, driving the issues that are being brought to the table, and driving the decision-making around how to address those issues. So that's the end of my presentation. So thanks, and maybe we can open it up for questions or conversation.
Thank you so much, Stephen. I just have a quick question. How much time do we have, Tim? We can find that out in the chat.
We have until about 2:15, so about 20 minutes left.
Hopefully I left enough time.
Yeah.
Sorry about that.
No, it was super concise. It was wonderful.
You want to go, Michael?
I was going to let you start this off, Fadi. Sorry, awkward silence. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say thank you so much, Stephen. This is so extremely relevant. We were just having a conversation this morning in studio, in fact, as we were introducing exercise 3 about agency and what designers, where are our limits in humbleness, number one, and what is the extent of our ability to actually create meaningful change? Is it through and I think what your talk really showed us is that there's a combination of process, advocacy, and physical stuff, like physical space, spatial things. And those things cannot be divorced from each other. And at some point, we really needed to kind of figure out processes and methods that make the spatial and physical stuff more just and work for more people than less. And there's a kind of moment in which I guess my long-winded way of getting to your question is, do you really believe we're at a new moment in time or an inflection moment in time where we really do need to tie those things with each other again, right? Like at some point, the designer, planner, urbanist, the like scary modernist moment in time in which there was this huge kind of disassociation or break from issues of social justice, environmental justice, and like the urbanist or the architect or the planner with a capital A, capital P thing. And then we had spent some time where we kind of like all distance ourselves and said, this is someone else's, like it's socioeconomic issues, it's trickle down economics, it's the engineer's fault who built the highway. Like there was a moment in which we kind of avoided these problems because it just felt like it was beyond our scope. And do you believe maybe we're now at a time where we're kind of having to think about these things again or not?
Yeah. Well, that breaking apart was really the creation of a false binary, which I think has first made our disciplines particularly harmful to communities with all of the sort of the history you were just sort of referencing a little bit. But also it has made us, as you said, feel as though it's somehow exempt because these things are beyond, the pale of our disciplinary expertise and purview. And so it sort of gives us an out to say, well, this is terrible. And as a human being, I live a good life and I stand up for justice and I call things out when I see it. But as a professional, there's no place for that. And this kind of, binary is not only false because everything we do has an impact. Everything we do is in response to some ideological thrust, whether it is in support of and sort of projection of that ideological thrust, or if it is in opposition to, but the neutrality doesn't exist, right? And so we either end up fooling ourselves and accidentally causing harm or missing opportunities to provide a great service to society, or we, well, we either do that or we just remain irrelevant. So the choice between irrelevance or harm, if that's all we've got left, then I think we do need to make a change. And I think that change is happening. It is being really kind of accelerated by students in academia, for sure. Students are demanding this, and they are, everyone are re-examining their curriculum and pedagogical approaches, their reading lists, the topics that they're taking on, the way those topics are framed. And I think, for the most part, design is out of practice, pedagogically and practically. And so like these things that I presented today seem like common sense, I hope, to most people. But they're like somewhat like experimental in some ways, because we don't have just, a lot of recent activity in this kind of social impact design / design we all think is good design space. And so really taking on that space as a single space, I think is important. And those who don't will be irrelevant.
Yeah.
There was building on that discussion, there was I think a really interesting kind of aspect of your work that I wanted to kind of call out, but for our students in this course, but more broadly, I think too, which is, framing a design intervention. So you spoke about, with the Portland's project, the idea of, idea, moment in time and client. You spoke a little bit about the kind of adjustment of the institutions in Cincinnati, and then the idea of governance structure with the Emerald Necklace. These are all kind of these sort of pre-designed moments where, big decisions are getting made that ultimately structure the outcome of built form. And I think that's such a powerful moment for designers to engage in, which so often we don't. And I guess one of the things I wanted to ask specifically is like the tools for engaging those moments as a designer. And I wonder if you could speak to those, because it seems that visualization, kind of just visualizing existing conditions to reveal potential opportunities, or what other tools you think are maybe that designers can use to engage this part of the process that doesn't feel like it's immediately about kind of design or physical space.
Yeah, I mean, I would say one tool, method, part of the process that is really important is really going directly to an understanding and a sort of unearthing of the histories around a particular site and a particular infrastructure. There are always different kinds of communities that live around them, and they didn't just like wake up one day and they were living there. And so what are the histories of the site and the particular infrastructure that we're working on? What is the relationship between those histories and the people that are there and their current conditions? And so that as a kind of a tool, a sort of a historical analysis that connects to a sort of demographic and physical present day is really important. The work that's being done by cities or by civil society groups, friends of groups, these kinds of folks, the types of projects and programs that they're doing, really doing a kind of an equity audit internally to understand what are the goals of these projects and programs, who are they meant to serve, and what are the metrics for success? Are they meeting their aims? Are the aims even the right aims? Do we need to go back to a kind of a theory of change? Like what's the big idea here? And then how are the things we're doing related to that? So really doing a kind of an audit of the programs and projects that have recently happened and are being planned and underway. Really looking at the partnerships, the various groups that are or are not involved in those projects and programs, and perhaps are doing work that is going to be impacted by the particular project that we might be working on, even though that might not be the work that we're doing, and finding ways to identify collaborative opportunities between those various groups and the work that we're doing, so that our work is both informed by the work of others in these other sectors, but that we're also contributing to the successes of their own initiatives. Yeah, I mean, there's a few. Let me think of some more.
No, that's great. That's great.
There's a couple of questions here on the chat. Michael, I don't know if you want to have a follow-up or if we should just jump into them. I think they all seem to like also link with each other. So I think the conversation could continue nicely from there. The first question is from Professor Leah Margolis, and she is asking, her comment says, "Thank you so much, Stephen, for such an informative and inspiring talk. I was really interested in the very first statement about understanding communities relative to infrastructure, the church, the park, the community center. And how does that factor into the projects you described?" I think that's a really actually excellent connection to be made. I completely agree. And I'm just wondering, Leah's wondering, how do you factor that into your projects?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. There's a sociologist, George Lipsitz, which talks about this dominant presence in the United States, and Canada is probably the same, of a white spatial imaginary. And it's a sort of a space of sort of differentiation. So you have zones of things that are appropriate or not appropriate in different spaces. There is a kind of a sameness about things, and there's a sort of a general imposed order. And then he sort of presents a sort of a counter narrative, which he calls the Black spatial imaginary, which is really, it's rooted in difference. It's rooted in fact, solidarity among difference, because if you're organized, if the sort of white spatial imaginary is organizing you according to something as arbitrary as the color of your skin, then all of the people that get organized in that space are extremely heterogeneous in their backgrounds, in their interests, in their socioeconomic status, in their capacities, in their, in their challenges, but they're all then there together. And so from that sort of space emerges a collective identity. That collective identity has come to manifest in spaces that are sort of outside of the white gaze, whether it was, hush harbors during times of slavery, where enslaved people would actually go out into a designated space, and they would pray together, and they would talk together, and they would sort of have those communion spaces, or freedmen's towns after slavery was abolished, folks moving outside of the city to try to get out of people's way because everything was wrong that they were doing if they were in the sort of white dominant space, and all the way to civil rights era times, where a lot of meetings happened in barbershops and salons and skating rinks and music parlors and these kind of spaces, which were not going to attract that many white people in general, and became safe spaces for exchange, dialogue, ideation, imagination about the future. And so really making sure that those spaces are considered, and this is when I talk about, the impact. You make an infrastructural investment, that's going to have an impact on the adjacent block and the few blocks deep into the neighborhood. There are businesses that are in those spaces, which have been there and survived the test of time through all of this. And now this big investment, which is intended to improve the livelihoods of those living in these neighborhoods, has the potential to increase that value in a way that pushes those businesses out. And if those businesses leave, those spaces of communion, of exchange, of dialogue, of sort of social imagination end up getting pushed out. And then those spaces no longer provide that anchor and that support and the ability for a sort of a cultural identity to remain and flourish. So that's a bit of a long-winded answer to Liat's question, but those spaces and the spaces outside of the work that we're doing are equally important to the work that we are specifically focused on, the drawings we're doing. And so we need to connect those to those spaces in our minds and in our process and in our engagement, and then ultimately have that reflected in our designs and our sort of policy initiatives that go along with those designs.
So we've got another question in our Q&A from Bruce Gilchrist. And first, he says, fantastic lecture, so I'll just say that on his behalf. But then there's a couple of questions here, and maybe for the sake of time, I'll ask one of them. So how do you define with the community what a successful ratio is between introducing new market rate and inclusive housing options within a development in a community at risk of displacement?
That's a great question. So there are so many things that I think about this. So I'm going to try to just give you a couple of my thoughts, and that none of them are going to be an answer, but they give you clues into like my thought process. So one is, with the notion that everyone should have equal access to an opportunity to live wherever they want in the city. One thought experiment that could move us towards that would be to look at very high income neighborhoods and essentially require 90% affordable housing for every new development within that boundary. And then look at low income neighborhoods and require 90% luxury and market rate development in those neighborhoods. And the end result of that thought experiment is that everyone hates you. But it's the kind of thing that we have to think about. So, right? Because what does it mean? What are we trying to do? And what does it take to do what we're trying to do? So that's one thought. Another thought is, when we think about inclusionary development policy, which is essentially like whatever the municipalities requirement is for affordable housing, which is based upon some, someone's calculation, typically developers, telling them what the market will bear and what they will do at a maximum, and trying to get that number as high as possible. In Boston, it's like 13.5%. And then you get into the nuance of like affordability for whom. Is it, 80 to 100% area median income, or is it below 60% or below 30%? It gets into format of housing, right? So maybe it's like you have a lot of affordable housing, but it's all studios and 1 bedrooms. And so you're not addressing multi-generation families, which many immigrants tend to be pulling their resources for, thinking about their kids and grandkids. It doesn't think about atypical in terms of a sort of white dominant culture, two parents and 1.5 kids and a dog kind of families, where you might have a grandparent that's taking care of multiple generations, or you might have single parent households, or other sort of non-traditional household types. So all of those considerations are like nuances, which are actually critically important to consider and get right at every stage. But what I tend to think is, if a city is rezoning and they are thinking about upzoning and increasing the amount of housing they're providing in any neighborhood, if that neighborhood is already productive in some way, because oftentimes these kinds of things happen in kind of post-industrialized neighborhoods. If there's already a sort of small, scale industry that's happening, it's productive, it's not unsafe, it's not crumbling, it works for what it is, then set the standard, set the requirement that you need, not the one you think the market will bear. So in other words, if you need this development and this district to be zoned with 50 or 60% affordability, then zone it that way. See if anyone bites. If they don't bite in a year or two, change it to 40%. Nobody bites in a year or two, change it to 30%, and move in a direction until you find the right balance between what the actual market is willing to do, but starting from the side of what you actually need. And I don't know why cities don't do that, because a lot of the times it's a space that has been what it's been for decades. So what's the rush? Set the standard you want, and then move towards the thing that can actually work.
I think that's it so often feels, when you hear these numbers thrown at you, either by economists or developers, that somehow they're sort of set in stone, predefined and immutable. So I really appreciate the idea that this is something that should be sort of challenged and reimagined. So Fadi,
we're coming up towards the end of our time. I know, Stephen, you had also a really long and busy morning, so we don't want to keep you. But I just wanted to also mention that in the chat, you've got quite a lot of love thrown your way and lots of gratitude. And a few other questions that I think would take us way longer than 5 minutes to answer. So we don't want to keep you, but I just wanted to maybe just echo this one incredible comment by Heidi, I think, where she mentioned that your fantastic mentorship, Unearth, Physically Formed, Addressed in Landscape, fully relevant to emerging work as a non-mainstream midlife MLA, supporting new relations and ways of being in the community. So lots of deep gratitude here from many of us. Thank you so much, Stephen, for joining us today. Hopefully we'll have you back again. We can go to Chinatown and have our dumplings like you do every time you've come down to the city.
Mamas, you gotta go to Mamas.
Yeah, mother's dumplings.
Mothers. See, I always say mamas. Mothers.
But anyways, thank you so much, Stephen. So appreciated, extremely relevant, extremely helpful for our students and for our faculty. And as you mentioned, a lot of this drive is coming from our students. So they're really pushing us and pushing institutions and pushing our cities to become better places for everyone. So on that note, thank you everyone for joining us and for attending, and hope to be in touch back soon. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.